This is thank you. This is a real pleasure to see Ayala Fader today. She's a professor of anthropology at the Fordham University in New York. Her recent book is Hidden Heretics, and the previous one is Mitzvah Girls, which is almost always on my table. So it's your turn. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Thank you so much, Sonia, and thank you all for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here with you all today, especially to be part of this series in honor of the memory of Ada Rappaport Albert. So let me begin by just sharing my slides with you. Okay, everybody sees that, right? Okay, great. So I'm going to share some of my anthropological work on Hasidic Yiddish with you. And the topic for today is about really the implications of Hasidic men writing in Yiddish online and the changes that I suggest are happening to Hasidic print media as a result. Okay, so on Amazon.com, anyone can buy the latest copy of the new Yiddish language magazine, The Wecker, the Awoken one, founded by a group of ultra-Orthodox Jewish men who met in a Yiddish online-only forum. A quote, verified Amazon customer gave The Wecker 5 stars and described it this way: fills a gaping void, top-notch Yiddish reading material for ultra-Orthodox, the writer translates Chaim Eden. This publication makes you think, gives you the tools on how to think, but doesn't tell you what to think, gives you facts, not lies, educates you, and does not coddle you with wishful thinking. It has only one agenda: to impart knowledge. Another 5-star review that De Wecker offered said, a delight and pride to our beloved Yiddish language. But some 1-star reviewers were not so sure. One posted, some people are so open-minded that their brain fell out. Or De Wecker's writers and editors were basically inserting, oops. That's annoying. Okay. The Wecker's writers and editors were basically, quote, inserting doubt in everything that's holy for us for generations. De Wecker, pitched to an ultra-Orthodox Jewish male readership, is sold exclusively on Amazon because most brick and mortar stores that serve Yiddish-speaking ultra-Orthodox Jews, who are of course primarily Hasidic Jews, will not carry it. One Hasidic group even blocked the Amazon page where De Wecker is sold. Rabbinic authorities have ruled that despite its familiar ultra-Orthodox Yiddish, aimed at Hasidic men, it is filled with dangerous heresy that might create religious doubt. So today I ask what happens to gendered literacy, that is gendered reading and writing, in a multilingual religious community when digital media introduces new possibilities for men's written expression and interaction, specifically religious questioning or doubt. A variety of Hasidic men's written Yiddish, born on digital media, which I call Enlightened Hasidic Yiddish, offers a good case study. The pragmatics or the uses, the content, the form, and the digital origins of Enlightened Hasidic Yiddish made it threatening to ultra-Orthodox Jewish leadership, since it was primarily consumed and produced by Hasidic men who called themselves open-minded or enlightened or aufgeklärte, which was a reference to the 18th and 19th century Jewish Enlightenment, the Haskalah, which very much like today was a crisis of authority spurred by new social movements, technologies, and political changes to traditional Judaism. Let's see if this works better. Yes. I'm basing my presentation today on ethnographic fieldwork that I conducted over 5 years, which formed the basis for my most recent book, Hidden Heretics, Jewish Doubt in the Digital Age, or in Yiddish, as you can maybe see over here lurking in the English letters, Bahaltana Apikorsim. The methodology of anthropologists, for those who are not familiar, is participant observation, meaning that I both participated in and observed those I was working with. I went to parties and bars. I hung out online on social media sites. I read Frum magazines and journals. I conducted open-ended interviews, and I drew on comparative anthropological work on religious uncertainty and doubt, media and belief, and language. The case of Enlightened Hasidic Yiddish is certainly not exclusively about hidden heretics, but I'm drawing on this material because this emerging form of Hasidic men's Yiddish began with the Aufgeklärte, those who called themselves open-minded, but who remained more or less pious in many ways. In contemporary New York, open-minded men also called themselves maskilim, or the Enlighteners, explicitly comparing themselves to those from pre-Holocaust European past, whose attempts at reform included experimenting with new forms of language, written genres, and technologies, except in the case of the maskilim in pre-war Europe, it was the printing press. Open-minded Hasidic men today include those who are pious and simply intellectually curious, to those who actually were hidden heretics, that is, secretly and anonymously critical of the entire system of ultra-Orthodox Judaism while remaining publicly and externally frum. At the turn of the 21st century, first on blogs and then on social media, enlightened Hasidic men began to use Yiddish and English in new ways, not only discussing and exploring forbidden texts and topics together with anonymous others, but also undermining a key semiotic ideology. And that term actually means a cultural belief about signs. And that semiotic ideology was that Jewish intention or form or content could spiritually uplift any medium, making it kosher, that is religiously Orthodox and Jewish. So enlightened Hasidic men wrote and read in the supposedly kosher medium of their Yiddish, but they used that insider's vernacular with its ties to men's religious Torah studies and a more moral past for unkosher purposes. For some, to express heretical ideas and questions and challenge rabbinic leadership, and for others, simply reading and writing about the wider world, but always talked about with other Hasidic Jews in Yiddish. The digital Yiddish literacy practices, which I focus on here, became a threat to ultra-Orthodox rabbinic authorities, not only because those writing in enlightened Hasidic Yiddish undermined this Hasidic semiotic ideology, though. As they and others who wrote and read in English continued to interact online, their voices of dissent growing, they came to form what I call a heretical counterpublic. Here is that word with its definition, which is a marginalized group's assertion of an alternative discourse in conflict with the dominant public sphere. All contemporary life is made up of a number of publics and counterpublics. In this case, the heretical counterpublic, which began on blogs, moved to social media, and since then has spilled over to print media and networks of people who regularly meet in person. This heretical counterpublic asserted an alternative discourse to the religious ultra-Orthodox Jewish public by challenging and critiquing the authority of ultra-Orthodox leadership to interpret divinely inspired truth. Linguistic anthropologist Ilana Gershon writes, "A communicative channel is experienced as new when it enables people to circulate knowledge in new ways, to call forth new publics, and to occupy new communicative roles, to engage in new forms of politics and control. In short, new social practices." The digital literacy practices that led to a heretical counterpublic did just that. And on that new communicative channel, which included crossing media, men's Yiddish literacy practices were marshaled for non-religious purposes, for things like leisure reading, religious questioning, or personal expression. And these practices, I'm arguing, created a new public, one which anonymously challenged the authoritative Hasidic religious public. As one such writer told me on WhatsApp, what we're seeing now in my generation is a rebellion. So anthropologists of religion have written about the ways that pious subjects cultivate ethical ways of living and how religion is lived in the everyday. as fellow travelers, scholars studying religion and media have similarly focused on the ways that all kinds of media can facilitate the experience of transcendence or the divine. Of late, however, there has been an interest among anthropologists of religion in how members of religious communities may have engagements and commitments beyond the exclusively pious, including religious doubt. And one of the things that I have learned in my research is that doubt, like belief or faith, is central to religious communities of many sorts, and it's lived across semiotic media, such as the body, in hair, in clothing, language, and material culture. And people like Lynn Davidman and Zalman Neufeld have written about this too. Fewer, however, have examined the linguistic dimensions of religious doubt, especially in the context of digital reading and writing. And here I ask how religious doubt lived on and expressed through digital literacy might change existing relationships between religion and language. So here's a roadmap so that you can follow. I know it's hard on Zoom. I begin by integrating approaches from religion and media and language and media to contextualize Hasidic men's digital reading and writing. And then I'm going to be talking about two distinctive examples of Enlightened Hasidic Yiddish. The first is a Hasidic blogger's post. I'm sure many of you know him, Katlakanya. And also then a Yiddish forum, which I'm sure many of you are also familiar with, Kavishtiebel, where the open-minded interacted and, quote, wrote themselves into being in Yiddish. We might think of this variety of Yiddish, what I'm calling Enlightened Hasidic Yiddish, as a medialect, a form of written language that's spread through digital media. But Enlightened Hasidic Yiddish has also now moved to print media. And gendered literacies on a new medium contributed to the formation of the Heretical Counterpublic, which is changing not only men's Yiddish literacy practices, but potentially ultra-Orthodox Judaism as well. So let me turn now to a little bit of linguistic, cultural, and technological context for some of the claims I'm making about Enlightened Hasidic Yiddish. So as many of you know, I'm sure, Hasidic communities today in the US can be defined as triglossic, meaning the linguistic repertoire includes 3 languages, each used for distinctive communal activities. Hasidic Jews pray and study in the language of Torah, Lashon Kodesh. They speak and read in Yiddish, in Hebrew orthography as a vernacular with other Hasidim. And finally, many Hasidic Jews, especially women, speak, read, and write in a variety of English, both among themselves and with non-Jews. Hasidic Triglossia is socialized, as I've written about in the past, in gendered schooling, and boys and girls learn to use these 3 languages differently. Boys and men speak more Yiddish than women and girls. Even the varieties of Yiddish spoken and written are gendered. While both Hasidic men and women's Yiddish includes English components, men's Hasidic Yiddish has more influence from liturgical Hebrew and references to religious texts. Indeed, in my own research, I often needed help reading men's Yiddish writing because I had not had that Jewish religious education. And in fact, Isaac Bleeman and several other people have helped me sort of make my way through Kavishtiebel and other sites. Further, men's Hasidic Yiddish, while not a divinely inspired language as liturgical Hebrew is, still retains, I would say, some of its reflected glow. And this is due to its role in men's study of Hebrew religious texts, but also to the nostalgia that many feel for the language of pre-Holocaust Eastern Europe, a lost time and place that many Hasidic Jews, even hidden heretics, describe as a more moral place than today. Initially, the internet did not provoke that much concern among ultra-Orthodox leadership in the States. Hasidic Jews in general have not completely rejected technology or new media. Instead, drawing on theologically informed cultural belief about signs and ruled upon by rabbinic authorities, they have regularly infused non-Jewish media with Jewish content, Jewish form, and Jewish intention in order to uplift and transform the original. However, at the beginning of the 21st century, first on blogs, as I mentioned, and then moving to social media such as WhatsApp and different forums, Enlightened Hasidic men began to write anonymously online in Yiddish and English, and even to meet up in person to secretly create networks of the like-minded. Women were less prominent on the Heretical Counterpublic, although there were some. Most women, however, were unofficially limited to observing and commenting from the sidelines, much as they are in the ultra-Orthodox religious public sphere as well. Over the course of a decade, rabbinic authorities began to suspect, and I'm talking about the US in particular, that the medium of the internet itself was to blame for what they began calling a crisis of emuna, or crisis of faith. They took steps to filter computers and smartphones for content and to control access, appealing particularly to women when men refused to give up their smartphones, as women were called upon as guardians of the home. Many rabbis spoke out against the addictive nature of social media and its links to the slippery slope of religious doubt, with some even comparing digital media to the Holocaust. Men's digital writing and reading online was particularly threatening to rabbinic authority because of the central place of Jewish male literacy in Orthodox life. So men's Torah study, their reading of Hebrew and Aramaic texts and commentaries of the sages discussed with a partner in Yiddish in a chavrisa is fulfillment of their covenant with God, and as such, it hastens the coming of the Messiah. However, men who participated in the Heretical Counterpublic wasted time that could have been spent studying Torah, so Bitul Torah. Worse, they used that wasted time to challenge ultra-Orthodox authority with posts that undermined, criticized, and mocked rabbinic leadership, even while they experimented with new forms of self-expression and language itself. Further, Hasidic men's online Yiddish writing troubled the semiotic ideology that a Jewish language with Jewish intention should uplift and purify. Yiddish should have, through its essentialized Jewish nature, been unable to become a medium of doubt or questioning. As someone who left the community explained to me, Hasidic Judaism is supposed to be a culture of purity, and therefore Yiddish is a language that doesn't express heresy. Heimische Yiddish isn't a language that's supposed to house heresy. That is, the essentialized purity of Hasidic Judaism and Hasidic men's Yiddish should have made it an unlikely medium for heretical ideas. In fact, this Hasidic semiotic ideology has actually meant that until recently, there has been little communal regard for purism or standardization of Hasidic Yiddish, as I'm sure many of you know, as a spoken or written vernacular, because the form and the intention of Yiddish would uplift any code switching or borrowings from English. So let me turn now to my first example, okay, from a Hasidic blogger who imagined Yiddish for a new public. So Katla Kanya, hold on one second. Okay. So Katla Kanya was one of the very early Hasidic bloggers whose identity has never been discovered. He told me in a private message on Facebook that he wrote at all hours of the night, juggling his work and his family life. Unusual for the Jewish blogosphere, he wrote exclusively in Hasidic men's Yiddish, primarily accessible to other Hasidic men, not Hasidic women, or even ultra-Orthodox Jews, the Yeshivish, who of course don't use Yiddish as their vernacular. Katla Kanya used men's Yiddish to experiment with what the language could and should express. For example, he modeled his writing on Jewish religious scholarship, even while he parodied it, using his deep Jewish knowledge turned inside out, making irreverent fun of the whole system. In fact, the Heretical Counterpublic came to be such a threat to rabbinic authority, particularly because of the Leitzunis, the mockery of leadership, institutions, and way of life. Parody is a taboo genre more generally because it too is based on mockery. Leitzunis was not just rude or disrespectful, though. In Psalm 1:1, Leitzunis is actually conflated with sin and wickedness. And as Katla Kanya wrote to me on Facebook, I like subversion more than anything, and for that I have an unfair advantage writing for an easily mocked community. Katla Kanya explained further, my thrill was and is in conveying our life in an authentic yet heretical voice. And he used the Yiddish of Hasidic men's religious study to do just that. Katla Kanya had other religious aspirations for Yiddish as a language. In some posts, he experimented with resignifying Yiddish, giving it a new meaning, wanting to create a more literary, not necessarily religious language. quote, by us and for us, meaning Hasidic Jews. Hasidic Jews do not usually read, and some are even unaware of the rich secular Yiddish literature from pre-war Eastern Europe. However, though Katlakanya did know and was inspired by this literature, he didn't necessarily turn to it always on his blog because his use of Yiddish was not about embracing secularism. Instead, he experimented with translation of the American literary canon into Yiddish, providing an individualized aesthetic experience for readers in a familiar language. So for example, in one post, Katlakanya translated Robert Frost Stopping by the Woods on a Snowy Evening by Wald an Schnarche Nacht into Yiddish. However, he titled the blog post with the Frost translation not as evening, but as Marav in Wald, right? Where Marav is the time, of course, of Jewish evening prayer services. In effect, Katlakanya's post sacralized Robert Frost and secularized the Yiddish language, blurring the boundaries of both. His translation offered Hasidic men the chance to experience Yiddish reading as a leisure activity and Yiddish itself as an aesthetic experience for individual enjoyment. In making Frost's poem accessible using a familiar Hasidic men's Yiddish and translating an American literary classic to express enlightened ideas, of course, about life choices, Katlakanya offered a way to rethink the very purpose of ultra-Orthodox men's reading and of Yiddish too. Two Hasidic men that I spent a lot of time with remembered back to how shocking it had been to read Katlakanya's posts, who had such enlightened content, but were written in their own Hasidic Yiddish. Gavriel wrote to me, when I first read Katlakanya, I was traumatized for a day or two. And Zalman agreed, Katlakanya shook me to the core. I wrote back asking what it was about Katlakanya's Yiddish that had been so disturbing. And Zalman explained, it's because we're trained to dismiss a secular source. But when it's written in a Heimische Yiddish that only a person from within can, someone like me, that gets your attention. And it's disturbing. It made me think a lot. So let me turn now to my second example, which is about an online Yiddish forum and which takes up issues of language purism or linguistic purism, metapragmatic awareness, which I'll explain, but which is basically talk about talk, and aesthetics, language aesthetics. So those Hasidic men who blogged and participated in Yiddish forums also had increasing exposure to English through autodidactic reading and writing online and in person. Some Hasidic men chose to write online exclusively in English, in fact, in order to interact with non-Hasidic Orthodox Jews to reach a broader audience. And as they became more competent in English, their ideologies or their cultural beliefs about language began to change, and Yiddish in particular began to change too. So for example, two bloggers that I talked to, Hasidic Rebel and Strammel, told me that Hasidic Yiddish had linguistic limitations in addition to reaching a smaller membership. And this was actually the first time that I heard these kinds of critiques. Hasidic Rebel explained, the Yiddish I was reading was never about ideas, never about critical ideas. The language of critical ideas was English. Strammel told me that in Yiddish, you can't transmit ideas. You can't talk about anything but really, really simple. When I noted that some were indeed blogging in a sophisticated Yiddish, meaning Katlakanya and others, he suggested that they had to rely on Lashon Kodesh borrowings, though in fact, the Lashon Kodesh components of Yiddish have, of course, always been part of the language. Men like Strammel began talking about language using a discourse of purity that I had not heard in my earlier work articulated before. And this emerging ideology of language purism from greater exposure to English and its literatures would, I suggest, eventually influence the emerging variety of enlightened Hasidic Yiddish, as would the greater number of smartphones, which made writing Yiddish in the Hebrew alphabet and its orthography much more accessible. As Hasidic men continued to develop digital literacy, and I mean literacy on digital platforms, as well as proficiency in using digital media, enlightened Hasidic Yiddish developed its own standards and aesthetics. The familiar form of enlightened Hasidic Yiddish, written in Hebrew orthography and drawing on men's immersion in religious texts, was increasingly used to explore new ideas, secular knowledge, and engage in open-minded debates and individual expression for its own sake. Enlightened Hasidic Yiddish looked Hasidic on the outside, but its intent and content were often subversive and sometimes heretical. The existence of Hasidic Yiddish forums where writers were known to be enlightened contrasted to other kosher Yiddish forums, such as Welt or Yiddish Welt, Jewish World, which were mouthpieces for rabbinic authority and heavily censored by the administrators. On sites like Welt, Hasidic Yiddish was never allowed to be a medium for open-minded ideas, let alone heresy. However, in 2012, frustrated by that any criticism of rabbinic leadership or the system was routinely censored on Welt, a group of Hasidic men founded Kavestiebel, coffee room, the break room in a yeshiva or a synagogue, as an alternative borderline kosher forum explicitly committed to open-minded debate, including social criticism, secular literature, science, art, politics, and poetry. The homepage shows two figures who I guess look kind of male, sitting at a table drinking coffee with the Yiddish caption, Kavestiebel ruhig winkel zishmiasin in Verbringen. So a peaceful corner to chat and enjoy. Anyone could sign up for Kavestiebel, but they had to have a male username and icon, and everyone wrote in Yiddish. There were a few times where a woman I know wrote in English with a feminine pseudonym, and an active member wrote to her and suggested she use a male username and write in Yiddish so that everyone would understand her. Though the administrators of Kavestiebel drew the line at outright heresy, they took a few hours to delete such posts, eventually putting up in its stead, this post was removed due to heresy. In short, Kavestiebel was known to be an unusually tolerant site where diverse ideas, bodies of knowledge, and individual sensibilities could all be expressed in enlightened Hasidic Yiddish. In fact, a number of Hasidic filters now routinely block Kavestiebel. So Kavestiebel users spanned a whole variety of linguistic competencies and religiosities. Though most were at least interested in open-minded debate, one writer described the most active posters as, quote, the old guard and Maskilic giants, meaning a reference, I think, to the Jewish blogosphere of the early 2000s. There were some who just read other posts because they themselves had trouble writing in Yiddish, which was a legacy of their yeshiva schooling. Aaron, for example, told me that he often enjoyed reading the post, but he never posted anything. He explained, for me to put together my thoughts on paper is very hard. You never had to articulate your thoughts. You never even had to think. Another explained that unless you had gone to Kollel, where you might take notes in Yiddish on the Hebrew text or the Lashon Kodesh text, there was no reason to ever actually write in Hasidic Yiddish. Kavestiebel discussion threads, or eshkols, encouraged open-minded discussion. For example, there were reactions to secular films, art, music, and literature that only enlightened men would expose themselves to. There were insider political debates about the ultra-Orthodox system, discussions over ultra-Orthodox racism, limited secular education for boys, or what one poster claimed were unreasonably stringent takunis or proclamations about girls' modest clothing. There was even a closed section on Kavestiebel for married men called, quote, In the Bedroom, with frank talk about sex education, really something unheard of in Hasidic circles. Some posters on Kavestiebel subtly undermined the ultra-Orthodox semiotic ideology that if a medium looked and sounded ultra-Orthodox, one could assume it contained pious Jewish intention and content. For example, Kavestiebel writers played with a common American Hasidic strategy of transliterating English phrases into Yiddish, i.e. making them Jewish or making them kosher, but not in order to make English kosher. Rather, they used English in Yiddish for the purpose of sharing their growing fluency in secular American culture, while also poking fun at ultra-Orthodoxy. So one of my favorite examples is that one poster translated Taylor Swift's song Shake It Off into Yiddish, is Shokolas Avec, but wittily replaced one of the lyrics date with a basho, the short visit, of course, between a young man and woman that's part of Hasidic matchmaking. And probably, I think this substitution, along with the Yiddish translation, made Taylor Swift's song speak to ultra-Orthodox experiences, a kind of conversation with secular American culture, where a basho was not all that different from a date. Others used Yiddish transliterations of English idioms to fill in what they perceived to be an expressive gap in Hasidic Yiddish as a language, speaking to issues of purism in Hasidic Yiddish for some. So for example, posters used a cut above the rest or a cut above the rest, and here you have the transliteration, or phrases like who cares? A Kaveh administrator who I asked about this to told me that these English transliterations filled gaps in Yiddish to indicate certain emotions, especially once men had become more fluent in English. This was a new kind of language purism that some of the bloggers, as I mentioned, Shtoramel and Hasidic Rebel, had articulated too. Shtoramel told me that while Yiddish was, quote, juicy, zaftig, and good for uses in, quote, curses, idioms, and colloquialisms, it lacked, quote, words, definitions, and synonyms. Some years later, a frequent poster, Ephraim, told me that writing who cares in the Hebrew orthography of Yiddish expressed a half serious, half sarcastic, informal effect that the Yiddish language just did not have. Of course, the Yiddish language, as you all know, does indeed have a full range of expressivity, especially that of pre-Holocaust Eastern European Jews. But what Ephraim and Shtoramel and others' explanations of Yiddish's deficiency really speak to, I believe, is a growing dissatisfaction with the English component of contemporary American Hasidic Yiddish, which has been generally unproblematically integrated into quote unquote Yinglish. Those writing in English or Enlightened Hasidic Yiddish seem to be suggesting that their Yiddish should not have to rely on English or even Lashon Kodesh to express the diversity of human emotions and intellect. So writing and reading in Enlightened Hasidic Yiddish also, and this is the second point, led to a heightened awareness of language itself, evidenced in metapragmatic posts or talk about talk. For example, some on Kaveh criticized grammatical and spelling errors in vernacular written Hasidic Yiddish, defined as it is by its lack of concern with standardization. One person posted a picture of a letter that their child had received home from their Hasidic school, reminding the parents that children should only speak Yiddish in the home. But the person who posted this letter pointed out that there were 23 spelling and grammatical errors in Yiddish just on the very first page. As some Kaveh writers were increasingly writing and also reading English, were increasingly writing and reading English, Yiddish, and Hebrew literatures, their own writing practices began to merit discussion. There were explicit conversations about how English words should be incorporated into written Yiddish if they had to be used. And that's the category of metapragmatic awareness. So for example, a poster on Kaveh, I know that's very small, but introduced the topic of, quote, and this is a translation, of course, the creation of new Yiddish words, das Fabrizieren neuer Yiddische Wörter. Take the word elaborate. The poster wondered in his post if the Yiddish should be elaborieren, adding the Yiddish suffix to the English verb stem, or simply the English verb transliterated into Yiddish orthography. The writer prescriptively posted his conclusion that English words should not be incorporated into Yiddish grammatical structure. Instead, English words should simply be transliterated into the Hebrew alphabet to visibly maintain their English language origin, quote, as their grandfathers had done. And I'll just read the English translation and you can follow along with the Yiddish. So a person wrote terminen and conditias instead of translating terms and conditions. Oh, come on. Well, okay, terminen has become a Yiddish word by now, but conditias? I mean, what kind of new plague is this? Either write it in English or write the way our grandfathers did. Terminen und conditions. These kinds of posts suggest a growing interest among the enlightened in standardizing how Hasidic Yiddish incorporates English, making it a language that needed shared conventions and patrols along its linguistic borders like any other national language. Perhaps these are the linguistic seeds that will lead to the flowering of enlightened Hasidic Yiddish across media. The third category is that writers on Coverstiebel also began to experiment with Enlightened Hasidic Yiddish as a medium for individualized aesthetic expression. And this was an innovation from existing ultra-Orthodox expressive Yiddish culture, like Hasidic music or poetry or art, that aimed to inspire, morally uplift, or educate other Jews in a religious idiom. Menashe once told me, for example, that while arguing with his father about his desire to visit the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, his father said, "We, Yidden, are supposedly above art. We have the Toida and it's better than art." An argument over a poetry contest held on Coverstiebel, inspired by a rival poetry contest on Ayala, revealed how some were trying to transform Hasidic Yiddish into a medium for individualized aesthetic expression for its own sake. So since the post-war period, Hasidic newspapers and magazines have published Yiddish and Lashon Kodesh poetry in the States. The Ayala poetry contest used shared religious metaphors and textual references to inspire pious feelings in readers, which some of the Coverstiebel writers poked fun at. The Coverstiebel poems actually didn't differ greatly in form from those on Ayala. They too were either in Lashon Kodesh predominantly or a formal register of Yiddish without any English code switching, that is going back and forth between the two. Like those on Ayala, Coverstiebel poems almost all rhymed, and writers similarly drew on shared religious metaphors and imagery. However, the content and intent of the poetry on Coverstiebel was subtly different than Ayala's, tending to be about individual emotions, for example, romantic love, beauty in the natural world for its own sake, or even disappointment in God. The Coverstiebel poetry contest was reviewed by the Yiddish writer or poet, who I'm calling Shalom Bernstein, for the secular Yiddishist paper Der Vorwärts. Bernstein described the Coverstiebel poetry as honest, sincere, and emotional. However, he complained about the uninspired rhyming form of the poetry, which he said was, quote, filled with platitudes. Mischievously, as a troublemaker that he is, he then reposted that article on Coverstiebel, where in fact he regularly posted his own non-rhyming modernist Yiddish poetry. The way that some responded to him, I think, hints at an emerging enlightened Hasidic Yiddish reading public, one with its own masculine sensibilities and aesthetics, rooted in shared religious text, but which uses Jewish languages for the purposes of individual expression. One frequent writer, who I'm calling Gefilte, posted on Coverstiebel, and here is the Yiddish, and I will, it's his response to the critique that was published in the Forward, and I'll just read the English. My response, Shalom, is that the Coverstiebel poetry campaign caters to Hasidic Jews according to Hasidic Jews' flavor in poetry, and according to how they're used to reading poetry from Dunash, Baruch Chazak, Chassam Sofer, introductions to Sforim, and so on. When you put up your poems in the Stiebel every so often, no one knows what the heck they're saying. Classical poets can't critique rap from Harlem. Both are artful, each in its own way. Gefilte made a case for tolerance, pluralism, and relativism regarding aesthetic values. Their Yiddish poetry, he argued, drew on religious Jewish text, since it was the literature and languages that Hasidic men had been steeped in. However, they used ultra-Orthodox language for different enlightened purposes. There were, Gefilte implied, many ways to produce art, each with its own standard, its own history, and its own value. In fact, this was a radical idea, especially for ultra-Orthodox Jews reared on what many described to me as black and white notions of the truth. In fact, an inner circle of Coverstiebel writers were the founders of De Wecker, that publication sold on Amazon that strives to inform and entertain its readers rather than morally and religiously uplift. One of De Wecker's editors explained its innovation in a WhatsApp text to me, ironically echoing Bernstein's critique. He said, the standard Hasidic literature, the magazines and the newspapers, they're all written in a formal style. Basically, there's very little expression, lots and lots of cliches, also very little personal. People don't share vulnerabilities. Wecker embraces every style. Whatever goes anywhere can go in the Wecker, as long as it's not kfira or nivel peh. So whatever people can share about their life, they can say anything, say new ideas and the way they write, and it doesn't have to be formal. De Wecker editors were also committed to professionalism, itself something of an innovation for Hasidic Yiddish publishing. Unlike Yiddish newspapers or Hasidic newspapers, they copy-edited for spelling, some grammar, and rejected code switching into English when there was a clear Yiddish equivalent. There were other similar Yiddish publications, including a straightforward Yiddish news magazine, Moment, and a new book analyzing and critiquing Hasidic boys' education by none other than blogger Katlakanya. These Hasidic writers have been creating a vibrant, enlightened Hasidic Yiddish online and in print, with new spaces to read and write, expanding the heretical counterpublic for open-minded Hasidic men. And as one, quote, Hasidic guy explained, and hat tip to Isaac Bleeman for this, when I grew up, I mean, before the internet, there wasn't anywhere to write. Even if a Hasid or a Husid wanted to write in Yiddish, he had no place to write. You understand? Nowhere. Now you can write online or WhatsApp. People want to write, so automatically Yiddish becomes a language. The language is reborn in a certain sense. I would add that the language is reborn, but it is exclusively so for men who are fluent in reading and writing Hasidic Yiddish and who have access to computers and phones. And this meant that the heretical counterpublic's alternative discourse was dominated and remains dominated by Hasidic men. So let me turn now to a few broader implications, since I'm an anthropologist, for what this case study might tell us. Hasidic men's digital reading and writing has implications for new directions in the anthropological study of, as I mentioned, gendered literacies, media, and religion. So first, in addition to focusing on language and literacies in explicitly religiously institutional or ritual contexts, such as prayer or religious schools, as so many have done so productively, we should include how religious literacies interact with other kinds of literacies across contexts. And what this would mean would be requiring examining repertoires or big groups of gendered literacies, which I would argue for non-liberal religious communities like Hasidic Jews certainly more accurately reflects religious life, where there aren't these neat distinctions between the religious and everything else. Second, those writing about media and publics have less often attended to language and literacy practices, except for perhaps someone like Jeremy Stolo. While those writing about digital language on a new medium, often coming out of communications, have less often focused on the creation of publics. However, reading and writing on a digital platform has all kinds of implications for broader linguistic practices, which are in turn relevant for the formation publics and counterpublics. And a really great example of this that I read recently is an article by Menachem Blondheim and a few other authors about the ultra-Orthodox in Israel, and they describe, this group of researchers describes how rabbis required not only that phones be filtered to protect from secular content, but also prohibited texting, making kosher phones talk-only phones. And they explained that rabbis in Israel feared that texting would enable the easy sharing of subversion, gossip, and communal criticism, less the content than the medium itself, that is, which affords a certain kind of interaction. And because rabbis in Israel, unlike rabbis in the States, had a great deal of influence over corporate phone companies, the new talk-only phone policy was actually enforced. So considering dynamics among literacy practices, media, and publicity really speaks to some of the broader economic and political implications related to maintaining hierarchies of religious authority. In addition to that, a counterpublic might have unexpected effects on multilingual gendered literacy practices by creating new kinds of spaces for re-signifying relationships among languages in multilingual communities. So to take a very far-flung comparative example, Sarah Hilleward draws on non-standard varieties of Swahili used by youth on Facebook. She works on an island called Lemba, and she argues that social media offers the opportunity to redefine the value these languages have attached to them. Similarly, enlightened Hasidic men's digital reading and writing redefine men's Hasidic Yiddish from an essentialized Jewish vernacular, despite its lack of standardization and openness to mixing from other languages, to a written Jewish language that could have heretical or at least enlightened Jewish intention, yet still be authentically Hasidic. Reading and writing on the Heretical Counterpublic made men's literacy in a Jewish language a challenge to rabbinic authority. It expanded the possibilities for written Yiddish by disengaging itself from a non-liberal iteration of religion without ever becoming or even wanting to become secular. And finally, the anthropological study of religion and language and literacies should include doubt or questioning of many kinds, made public with others across media. What does doubt look like and sound like? Where is doubt audible and where is it silenced? What can be written and what can only be spoken or thought? And to these questions, I would add we must include which media, why, and how. So let me conclude very briefly now, and then I look forward to having a discussion with all of you. Wait, I think I have a slide here. Hold on one second. Yes, okay. So Kava Stiebel and De Wecker, of course, continue to be lively spaces to exchange ideas and learn open-minded, not quite heretical accounts of current events, of history, of secular scholarship, all written in a familiar yet enlightened Hasidic Yiddish. Men are still the most common producers and consumers of these new forms of writing and reading. Hasidic women who were enlightened or open-minded had their own ways of talking, reading, and writing, mostly in English. However, their literacy practices were less marked because they do not and did not do the same theological heavy lifting as men's. The coronavirus pandemic and the growing suspicion among many Hasidim of state public health policies, including vaccination, has addressed new topics, has created new topics to address in enlightened Hasidic Yiddish. For example, the April issue of the Wecker includes an article with a statistical analysis of how the coronavirus disproportionately affected ultra-Orthodox communities in the New York region, something that was contested in the communities. It is an indictment, the Wecker article, it's an indictment of the refusal by some Hasidic Jews to take precautions such as mask wearing or sheltering in place and social distancing. One of the editors of De Wecker was even interviewed by The Atlantic, who described the Wecker article this way. It's Emma Green. She wrote, the article uses the decidedly secular language of bar charts and line graphs crowded alongside passages of dense Yiddish text. I could not replicate their findings. They're based on dozens of weeks worth of death notices published in Yiddish. But what matters is that the Wecker writers wanted to quantify the effects of behavior they were seeing every day in their neighborhoods. As one writer told me when I asked about the Yiddish in the Wecker article, he said, statistics and science, I'd argue, always read new, i.e. innovative, because the subject is new to Hasidic Yiddish. As gendered religious life worlds change, so do languages and literacy practices. New media and old create opportunities and restrictions as those living religious belief and doubt grapple with linguistic resources to express their senses of self, understandings of the world, and possibilities for new publics. Thank you. Yeah, let me stop my screen share.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Granny.
We have a couple of questions. Maybe I will ask those who wrote their questions first. Easy, you were the first one.
Okay, well, I'll try if my internet is stable enough. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thanks, Ayala. That was fascinating. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned the masculinity and the maleness of Kava Stiebel, and that's certainly been my experience. It feels that way. I'm just wondering if we know to what extent women are or aren't writing under male pseudonyms in both De Wecker and in Kava Stiebel.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. The women that I worked with for Hidden Heretics, at least 20, I would say one told me that she's regularly on Kava Stiebel. And the rest told me that, and of course, this is a small number, the pitfalls of ethnography, right? But the rest of them told me that it was too hard. It was hard to read. And in terms of the Wecker, I don't know, but I know, yeah, that's an interesting question too. My sense is the audience is assumed to be male. And even in Moment magazine, which is, I think slightly less controversial, a kind of news magazine, it's something that men might read on Shabbos and women aren't. So my general impression is there will of course be some women who, are kind of intellectual Yiddish speakers, but that the majority weren't actually prepared to do that. And some of the findings of my broader fieldwork have also been that though people who lost their faith and remained in their communities changed politically in many ways, that gender divide was the last thing to go, if it ever did. And in most cases, it never did.
If I may add an interesting anecdote, because in non-enlightened Hasidic magazines, take maybe the two most kind of Malus and Belachtungen.
Right.
Both of them, I'm pretty sure, if anything, it would be mostly women writers. And the clue is usually in the fact that they don't write their first name, they just write Aleph something or by something.
Right.
It's quite interesting. And yes, you have less Lucian Koidishisms and stuff like that. But it is interesting why that divide has happened in the online sphere, but not in the traditional print media.
I think that's really an interesting question. And I do think it speaks to the idea of publics. Malus is a really interesting magazine. And in fact, it's a kind of purist Yiddish in and of itself, but it's also considered a family magazine. They have a kids section, and it's something that very frum families would read together. But there's all kinds of interesting kind of connections among not the writers themselves, but how we think of these as kind of aimed at different audiences and thinking about publics in particular. And I guess my argument for that would be that that's like almost, Malus to me is almost like a domestic magazine. It's in the domestic sphere. You bring it into your home. And the Heretical Counterpublic was in fact an alternative to the ultra-Orthodox public sphere. They're both publics, and women are not in those public spheres very much.
Thank you. I think Shipra was the second one. Could you ask your question, please?
Ayala, I found that really, really interesting. I think before I ask my question, to add to Izzy's, for the women, most of them had access to plenty of English magazines that they were allowed to bring into the house, be it the Mishpacha or the Ami. And so it's almost like if you have it, you don't need to really seek an outlet. And because you're literate in English, most of them, they don't need to go find another alternative. It's just an idea.
Absolutely. And I think women's Yiddish reading, depending on which community, of course, but women's Yiddish reading is often less threatening than men's Yiddish reading, right? Like men should not be, men's English reading, because men should not be hanging around public libraries reading Tolstoy, for example, or whatever, or the New York Times, when they could be doing better things with their time. So yes, that's true. The only thing that I would say to that is that the Heretical Counterpublic that I've described online that met in person as well really was not exclusively online. It was a place where people created friendships. And I met many enlightened, they didn't call themselves that usually, enlightened ultra-Orthodox women, but those friendships were very important for making them feel like they weren't insane, which was often the communal explanation for questions about, religious doubting and things like that. And so in a way, being able to participate in the Heretical Counterpublic or not also affected their offline.
Oh, absolutely.
Their in-person.
You have to be so careful with what you say if you want your children to stay in school, etc. You have to be extremely careful. My question actually was, do you see this growing Enlightened Yiddish presence online and Yiddish literature to almost be creating a this is very simplistic, but bipartisan a division between the enlightened Yiddish and educated Yiddish speakers and readers and writers versus those who choose to or feel unable to access the internet and see Yiddish as this very sacred language. And so it's almost the need of educated Yiddish-speaking schools that educate the children versus the standardized Chadorim, for example, who choose not to.
Oh, that's an interesting question. You know, everyone that I worked with and met was really a self-taught. It wasn't an issue of learning, and boys anyway don't really learn Yiddish in school. They use it. Girls do learn Yiddish. There's a little Yiddish textbook that I bought and looked at. But I do think, and that was sort of one of my projected thoughts, and people have suggested that this is accurate, that there is a kind of new kind of Hasidism, and we might think more broadly ultra-Orthodoxy emerging that uses language in particular kinds of ways, but it's not limited to language. It's also about interpretations of halacha and position in the non-Jewish world. And so some people talk about modern Hasidish, and I've been really interested to see communities kind of popping up on the outskirts of more solidly ultra-Orthodox from neighborhoods, like you have Tom's River, you have Airmont around Muncie. So we see this geographically as well. So it's not as if people are moving down, you know, to the Lower East Side or ironically hipster Brooklyn, right? It's that they're kind of staying close. Modern Orthodox schools don't speak to them, I think, culturally and aesthetically in a lot of ways. And so I think using this language, again, I think particularly for men, I'll be really interested to see if there is an emerging variety of women's language. I know that men who were either hidden heretics or even just enlightened began, again, self-taught, began to use English in new ways too. And for men, that could be really dangerous. Like one person told me that when he was read a shidduch, the girl didn't like him because his English was too fluent, because that was suspicious. You know, it told people that he was either reading by himself or going online or something like that. But I'm really interested in the back and forth between online media and print media. I think that's really interesting. And then eventually that's, if not already, that's going to affect spoken language.
Yohanan Lowen?
Yeah, I would like to make a comment. Once is about the Malois. The Malois is my relative, and it's mostly written and edited by one woman. She's a mother of children, except one article every month that is from her husband. And this is in the beginning of the journal, and this is about rabbinic stuff. Second thing about women writing in the Kavashtibel, not all, there is, I know some women who write in Kavashtibel and in the Wecker, but they are not, they are ex-Hasidic, they are no longer Hasidic.
That's really interesting. Thank you for sharing that. It's really fun to see your names after just seeing you online, actually. But thank you. I didn't know that. That's interesting. So they have gotten more linguistically fluent in Yiddish after leaving, which I guess is
no. I know. For example, a woman that when she was Hasidic, she was a songwriter. She was a poet and a Hasidic songwriter. And when she left, she is writing in Yiddish for Kavashtibel and for the Wecker and for Forwards.
Yeah.
So what did you say that it's interesting for you to see me online? What did you mean?
I mean, I think we're Facebook friends.
Okay, thank you.
Then Tali Loventhal, please, Tali.
Okay, well, thank you very, very much, Ayala. I actually recently read your very, very interesting Behaltene Apikosim, Hidden Heretics. And one thing it made me realize is the terror that smartphones can induce in the heimische Welt. It's maybe more careful using a smartphone in the street in my heimische Gegend.
My work is done then.
But because they all know Lubavitch use smartphones, you know, like I sometimes think the attacks on smartphones are as a kind of way of dividing Lubavitch from everyone else. But now I see that it's got its own rationale. Now, my question, you mentioned in the book, and you mentioned just now, the idea of changing Haredi orthodoxy. So I'm looking at the work of Yochai Chakak, who is writing about a different situation. It's the Israeli Haredi Yeshiva, not specifically Hasidic, but the way the fact of the dropouts emerging from those yeshivot have made the universe of discourse of teachers slightly different. And I'm wondering whether you have seen anything like that in New York, in the heimische groups that you are dealing with, whether a question that 20 years ago would have just been said, oh, it does that because you can't ask such a question. Now, perhaps, might it be taken more seriously and treated in a different way in a kind of school or yeshiva situation?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think so. First of all, I wrote just a little bit about this, but the category in the States is at-risk youth, right? Where that category of at-risk is not only what quote unquote secular people might think of at risk, like, you know, drugs and dropping out of school, but also religious doubting. So that's sort of folded in there. I think that I've documented that there's a lot of concern for at-risk youth. There's a kind of, I called it a crisis of emina and a crisis of authority. There's for adults who are leaving, but there's a lot of concern, of course, for children and especially boys in yeshiva. I've talked to a number of therapists and life coaches, sort of people peripheral to the mental health profession. What I've noticed is that there is a yeshivish critique of Hasidic education, where the critique is that Hasidic education has become too rigid, too strict, too by the book, and doesn't include the kind of emotional, the feelings that a religious, a Hasidic Jew should have, that's sort of become almost, you know, fossilized. And there's an argument among some ultra-Orthodox educators as well, but also the yeshivish, that Hasidic schools should be a little more open to questioning, that instead when a boy asks a question that would be considered apikoursis, that instead of like saying, you know, you're terrible, or hitting him, that instead there might be more room for conversation. I actually think that some of the bleeding in of a therapeutic framework into things like education, that's already, I've written about that for homes, and I think that is kind of influencing schools, for sure girls' schools, very, very slowly boys' schools, but I think the fears about kids at risk might actually change some of the ways that boys in particular are taught. I mean, at the opposite end, you have, you know, Naftuli Moster and the whole Yafid movement. So I think boys' education is a real bone of contention because it's about the next generation, I guess.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Esther, please.
So I was just wondering if you know anything about the age distribution of the users of these online forums, because I kind of feel like they might be younger. And then, you know, if they are sort of overall younger, then that could have a connection to the type of language they use. So I'm kind of questioning, you know, you were sort of talking about how the forum influences their language, but I'm sort of wondering whether it's just also at least a two-way street, that, you know, the people that appear on these forums have this type of language anyway.
Yeah, that's a great question. Definitely a two-way street. The people who founded Kava Stiebel are now in their 40s. So they're not as young as you might think. But of course, there are now, you know, that person who I quoted, Aaron, is very young. He's like in his late 20s, maybe mid 20s. But there's definitely a divide, a generational divide, at least for, and this is not speaking just about the Enlightened, but more broadly my research with you know, people who were questioning. The people that I met at first, they began questioning in their late 20s, let's say. And, you know, everyone said to me it was not because of digital media. It had nothing to do with digital media. It was reading books in libraries. It had, you know, digital media was the way I met other people and didn't feel so crazy, but it was that. But I think for young men now, and probably women too, actually, no, and women too, the accessibility of going online, and the reason smartphones, of course, are so threatening is they're so private. You don't need a big monitor. They're just in your pocket, right? I think that definitely the younger generation is drawing on the older writings on the blogs, which are, you know, a lot of them are still up, but they're definitely creating something new themselves. I mean, the Wecker is people in their 40s, from what I understand. It's not people in their 20s, but their writers, you know, are from all over. And so it's interesting to think about. Of course, it's always younger people who are on the forefront of linguistic change, as we know, right? Teenagers are the ones changing language. That's something I didn't really have that much access to. Maybe some of you do, but I wasn't talking to yeshiva buchers much, you know?
Yeah, one would like to have a sort of you know, hidden recording in a yeshiva kavestival.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting to think, you know, people that I spoke to who began doubting in their late 20s, who are older now, talk about, you know, sneaking books into yeshiva and listening to, one guy said, you know, like Led Zeppelin, even though he had labeled his cassette tape, you know, this Rebbe's Shir, but which was quite ingenious. But I don't know. It's a very good question. Actually, I think I'm going to ask a few people I know, like how far the Wecker goes. Like, are yeshiva boys, you know, secretly reading it? I don't know. Maybe some of you do.
Yeah, I'd love to know that too. I don't know. Yeah.
Well, I think Mordechai Miller, right?
Yes, yeah. My question is, are you observing the emergence of a, let's say, completely new variety of Yiddish, or via this stronger connections or availability with the outside world, or the availability also of non-Hasidic literature for the Hasidim, rather a re-emergence of, let's say, more standard forms of Yiddish, the Literatursprache, the pre-war Literatursprache. There are tens of thousands of books available online now in this variety of Yiddish. Is this reflected in the use of language in these forums?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I will say, I think the answer to that is no. I think this is a distinctive Hasidic Yiddish, and it's distinctive even in that poetry contest that I talked about. They don't want to write, from what I understand, in the Yiddish of the forwards. Like that's not necessarily for them. Topically, and in terms of vocabulary too, what I was talking about more was a kind of attentiveness to language. Most people who had lost their faith told me that they had, mainly men, but women too, told me that they had discovered secular Yiddish literature, like pre-war literature, and were outraged that they had not been exposed to that. But I don't know how much that's affecting. I think many read it, and maybe it is, but I do think that there's a sense that as an identity, there's a distinctive Hasidic form of Yiddish. And even if there's less code switching to make it Yinglish, like Yinglish, there's still Hasidic ideas and styles and ways of writing. I guess Malos would be kind of the pinnacle of that, or Wecker, that are distinctively Hasidic too. So I don't see those two coming closer, because everyone that I worked with was pretty clear. Not everyone, let me retract that a little bit, but the majority of people did not necessarily want to become secular. And for an anthropologist of religion, that's very important. Some did want to just, drop out and go OTD and leave. Most didn't, none did really because of their families, but many people just wanted to live a slightly different, less strict Hasidic life. It was, and that's where you saw the kind of elaboration of Hasidic cultural forms, not just as religious, but as a whole cultural way of life.
Thank you. Actually, it comes to my mind, I think in an earlier lecture, Isaac Bleeman talked about this question of age in Kaffeestiebel. So Esther, probably you should connect with him. I don't know if he's still in.
Are you, Isaac? What do you think?
I'm here, yeah. I talk a little bit about the demographics of Kaffeestiebel in an article that I can put in the chat, but short of doing a comprehensive survey of users, which will already be, a self-selecting group of people who happen to see it that day and will respond. I use Kaffeestiebel to recruit people to talk to offline, and I think I met with maybe 12 or 13 Kaffeestiebel members, and they were all men. They were all in their early to mid 30s, maybe a few late 20s. They had all been married, so it's a very kind of demographic, and they were all like, most of them were from Satmar, but there were some other, English groups. So it is a demographically kind of homogenous group in a sense. And certainly the age thing is the age bias, the imbalance in age groups is going to be a problem when you do research online in any language. So yeah.
Thank you. So first, they should be Sam Hopper, as far as I remember. Sam?
Right. Thank you very much for appearing here, by the way. So earlier on, you mentioned sort of this notion of this old guard on Kaffeestiebel of potentially being connected to the J blogosphere, and I'm wondering if there's any direct continuity there of audience, of culture, of writership.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah, I think there is. I mean, people I worked with, that was the genealogy. Like it started on the J blogosphere. And then as people stopped blogging, not just, Jews, like everyone stopped blogging in the mid 2000s, right? Like that stopped being the cool thing to do and moved over to social media. Many of those people also moved over. And so you have it's interesting. You have lots of small groups forming on Facebook, for example, before Facebook was so, old fashioned and unhip. Those groups came and went. And I followed one in particular where men and women wrote together. It was in English because one of the women complained that she couldn't understand when they switched to Hebrew. But it was a Facebook group that was private and closed, and it was a place to have intellectual discussions about things people were reading and about raising their kids and stuff. But those Facebook groups, came and went. But definitely there was a lot of crossover. Some of those bloggers left. So actually, went OTD or were kicked out of their communities. Some of the big famous bloggers. So that kind of forms another temporality, a historical trajectory. But they were considered, the maskilim, the big bloggers, because they were also, I think, interestingly, not only were so well known by other Hasidic and ultra-Orthodox Jews. Some person told me that the Rebbe's Askanim used to print out some of the blogs. He wouldn't go on, some of the Rebbe's wouldn't go online, but his Askanim would print some out and show them to him and say, you better be a little worried about this stuff. But not only so within, Hasidic circles, but they, some of the Hasidic bloggers, like Hasidic Rebel and Streimel, got a lot of press in the New York mainstream media. And so there was a kind of famousness to them. And so those were the giants of yore, I think. And again, a lot of them know each other and continue to be in touch, which I think is really interesting in person as well,
Thank you very much. Very interesting.
Thank you. Jeff Agis. Yes, please.
Yes, hi, Dr. Fader, and or actually, Dr. Lowenthal may know the answer to this as well. You mentioned those who wish to remain within the Hasidic world, but lead a less restrictive life.
Mm-hmm.
For those people, is Lubavitch an option? And do any of them ever port over to Chabad?
Not in my experience. Lubavitch is its own thing, no? Yeah, I mean, I think that would be
well,
weird
that's why.
to move over like that. Yeah. I haven't heard of that.
No, I haven't either. But
Yeah.
but my connections to Orthodoxy are limited. I have a nephew in Chabad, but he teaches in a modern Orthodox high school, and
Right.
yeah. So I don't know.
I can say a little about that if you want.
Sure.
Well, there is a Chabad, I don't know what you would call it, institution called Hilchot Menachem, which has a branch in Borough Park and one in Monsey, which is a Hasidic facing Chabad Lubavitch institution aimed at teaching Chabad teachings to people from other Hasidic groups. And so some of the leaders, and you have it in Israel as well. You have it in Borough Park, you have it in Jerusalem. In Israel, it's actually much bigger, and they have kollel that they've set up. And many of these people who study Chabad Hasidus, they retain their old affiliations. They retain their dress, the traditional Hasidic dress, so whether it's Satmar or if it's Ger or whatever, they'll retain the distinctive dress of those communities, but will identify on a kind of inner level and on a level of spiritual practice with Chabad. And some of these institutions are run by Hasidim from such groups. So, and some of them are quite well known. Rabbi Vechta in Israel, he came from Satmar in Williamsburg, but he actually had to leave the United States because this was back in like the 80s when it was like really quite dangerous to be seen to be a Lubavitcher when you were in those communities. So he moved to Israel. I had a teacher in the Chabad Yeshiva in Morristown, Rabbi Guns, who was he actually had taught in Vechta's Yeshiva in Williamsburg. He had been a mashgiach, and he told us about it, what went on in those days. But now all this is in the open. Back then it was kind of secret, but yeah, so there is, Hilchot Menachem is quite well established, and there are many families who affiliate with Chabad in that kind of way.
But is that for people who are having questions? Is it an alternative for them? It's just like a kind of an alternative to people who are still, I mean, it's like moving to Breslov, right?
Right. Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if it's, I think there's a spectrum, and I think that these kind of things, it's really about identity. I think there is a question component. I don't know if it's the same kind of questioning. And as you yourself were saying, many of these people, I think it has to do with this issue of not everyone wants to move out, right? And some people just want to be, they're looking for other ideas. Right. And I think they find in Chabad philosophy, which, and the Chabad literature, they have an outlet for dealing with some of these things in a way that's more kosher, that's a parallel Hasidic tradition. So I think there is a questioning element, but it's not a, yeah.
Well, that's because I heard of a Lubavitch woman who got sent Satmar couples who were having doubts, where one of the person in the couple had doubts or had actually lost faith, and she was able, because she had a different interpretation of Hasidus, she was kosher enough to be able to guide them and to kind of say, you can do this and that's okay. So you know, in one case, the wife made Kiddush, for example, and
Right.
she said it's okay, and her community accepted that.
Can I? There is something else, if I can quickly add, called Project Macomb by Alison Joseph
yes.
from During the City, which is not quite Chabad, but she's trying to get disillusioned Hasidim to become modern Orthodox with various degrees of
Yes.
success.
Various degrees of success, yes.
So the next question was from Zoe.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't know how much I've thought this through, but when we were doing our research, we met with, to me, a surprising number of people who, when we asked, what Hasidus are you, they kind of looked at us like, what do you mean? I'm Hasidic, right? So they weren't identified with a particular Hasidus. They didn't necessarily, you know, go to a particular Rebbe, but they were nonetheless Hasidic. They identified as Hasidic. And I wonder if you see a link between that and this kind of drive in some quarters towards a kind of modern Hasidism, whether those kind of Klal Hasidic groups tend to be more open, tend to be more questioning. I don't know.
I didn't actually. Like, all of the people that I worked with were affiliated with a Rebbe, you know, and they came from various groups, which I was not able to write about because of, you know, maintaining anonymity. But no, and it's funny that you mentioned that, because for my first project that resulted in Mitzvah Girls, I hadn't even known that there were Klal Hasidim, and I foolishly asked, you know, women, like, what's your Hasidus, which was actually not an appropriate question, really. But I learned that there were all of these schools that were not affiliated with a Rebbe, and that were really kind of just like generally Hasidish in style. So I think that's definitely on the rise, and it's, you know, it might be part of a more generalized crisis of leadership where families defect from following a certain kind of Rebbe or don't, especially at points of schism, which I think has had a huge impact on the communities. But I think one of the real disillusionment that men in particular had was with seeing their Rebbes as too human, you know, that in fact, that was kind of part of their disillusionment. So quite kind of the reverse. That's interesting.
Yeah, so I have particularly close links with Carlin, which is also a kind of, I mean, it's Hasidic, it's pretty strong, but they have relatively open ideas towards things like smartphones and so on.
Right.
And I think what you said is probably accurate for Carlin as well. Like, maybe because they have these open ideas, there tends to be less kind of questioning going on. It's maybe, the opposite relationship from what the Rebbes fear.
Exactly. Yeah, I think that's right. That's interesting.
Can I ask you briefly two questions? One very small. Do those hidden heretics themselves use the word masculine for themselves sometimes? Because masculine are very anti-heroes inside a Hasidic culture, and they do pick this?
They say that, yes. And yes, absolutely. I would not be making that up. No. They claimed that title because they saw masculine in Europe as reclaiming authentic Judaism. Like, and it's funny because in my reading, like, masculine were the great secularizers. It's like, I was like, what do you mean you're masculine? You don't want to be secular. So there was, and the really fascinating things that I learned were that they also used, just the way the masculine used autobiography, right? The genre of autobiography in lots of different kinds of ways. In a way, I parallel blogs to that. I think that's very similar. And the debates about what's a good language, what's a national language, what's a healthy language, all of those kinds of things. And the gender issues, I think, are very, very similar as well. You know, I was shocked by that. And I heard that early on. And it took me a while to figure out what I think is going on there. Yeah.
The second question is about field work. How difficult is this to reach, especially male informants or participants, and how difficult it is to find place to really meet each other? Is it always online, or how is it going?
Yeah, great question too. So this project was in some ways the inverse of my first project, meaning that it was not difficult for me to meet men at all. At first I met some bloggers, and I knew people from before in my research, and once I met one or two, they were very happy to introduce me to other people, other men. And that was really quite easy. I think my different position in the second fieldwork project, like as a professor, well, I shouldn't put quotation marks, I am, but as a professor was interesting to them. Many told me that they felt it was a relief to narrate their whole sort of saga of belief and doubt. We met often. If the person lived in Williamsburg, we met in hipster Williamsburg, like we met on the fringes again, or some of them came to my neighborhood on the Upper West Side of Manhattan. It wasn't that hard to meet at all. What puzzled me was I realized after a while that I was meeting all these men and I had not met a single woman, which told me that gender was going to be very important. And so I asked people to introduce me to women, and it turned out there was a whole network of women. But they were much more difficult to meet. They were more afraid. They were very worried that if their husbands discovered, they would divorce them and they'd lose custody of their kids. They had less time, right? I wrote about this a little bit in the introduction to the book, but when Hasidic men get married, they suddenly have all this time. I hung out with these guys in Barnes and Noble all afternoon, like on lazy afternoons. Their wives were not hanging out in Barnes and Noble, drinking coffee. They were at home with the children. So at marriage, women's lives become increasingly constrained. They have a surprising amount, I think, of independence in high school, but in New York at least. So there was that difference. Eventually, I found times and places to meet women, sometimes at an OTD person's house. We've met, or when the Vav was away in the country, when the family would go to the Catskills and there'd be an empty home, people would gather. Or sometimes we went into my world too. Like I went to a Yiddish concert in Central Park that was right in my neighborhood, and women came and said to their husbands, like, "Oh, I'm meeting that professor again. I'm busy tonight." So there were all kinds of crossing overs about what really constitutes the field. And it was very challenging in a lot of ways. I just actually met with them recently, with many of them. A person graduated and she had a graduation party in a bar that was very significant. It was a bar in Park Slope. So for anybody who knows New York, it's near enough. It's in the South Slope. It's near enough to the D train to be able to get to Borough Park or to get to Williamsburg. But definitely not in Williamsburg, and there's a backyard. And so we all met there to celebrate this woman. And it was very interesting to catch up and see, one person I didn't recognize. He was still in his community, but he wore jeans and a button-down shirt and nothing on his head, So people change over time, even as they kind of remain in parts of their communities and remain really concerned to not hurt their families. I'll just say one more thing, Sonia. I know you're interested in fieldwork, and so am I. It was really challenging, the issue of maintaining anonymity. I couldn't talk about certain things that I wanted to talk about, like, what groups these people were from, which I think is significant, actually. In a few cases, I had to make composites. Women were very, very anxious for me to tell their stories. And one of the really tricky things was they all recognized each other because it's not a huge community, and they were frightened of each other as well. And a number of people almost pulled out right as the book was going into copy editing. And I had to negotiate that. I had to negotiate that. I think that happens more and more in contemporary fieldwork, where we work with people who share our space and who have easy access to reading what we write and who are very invested in their own representation. So I've heard lots of cases of that, not only among Jews. I think it's going to be a continued issue for anybody who's doing ethnographic fieldwork.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have why wanted to ask some question.
Okay.
Can you?
Hello, me?
Yeah.
It's me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay.
We can hear you.
I wanted to comment about Lubavitch. Somebody asked if some of the OTD, if some of the doubters are going to Lubavitch. I know actually some OTD people that became OTD as a teenager, and then they married into Lubavitch.
Yeah.
And they had a Lubavitch family. And sometimes the children of them are going back OTD, partially at least. Yeah, that's interesting.
That is interesting. When I feel like Lubavitch and Breslov are kind of the alternative to when you can't quite fit into your group, you might go there to either of those because they're theoretically more permissive and less stringent. I mean, whether that's actually so or not, you know, but they're alternatives for families, and which is interesting because going OTD then is not, you know, this stark in or out. And that's something that Zalman Neufeld writes about, is that it's a continuum, you know?
That's why I asked, because I know that they're theoretically alternatives, and I know that many of them tend not to go into modern Orthodoxy. Have heard of one or two examples, but it's rare. So that's why I was wondering if Lubavitch or Breslov, as you say, I should have thought of that too, were viable alternatives.
Right.
But there's two kinds of like joining Chabad Breslov. There's like the Satmara who hides the Torahs of the Rebbe, like, and secretly reads it, and then there's the person who goes and takes off the Strauman and puts on a bend-on hat. Two kind of levels. And also Breslov is, I think Breslov, at least in Satmar, Breslov is a bit more acceptable than Lubavitch for.
Yeah, yes, that's my sense. But I would just note that you are talking about men, right? Like it's all normatively male. And I think that's something we do a lot in the study of Hasidim. And I think it's incredibly problematic. And, you know, nothing to you personally, but I was interested. There was a young woman that I heard about who during Shidduchim said that she wanted to marry somebody who would be willing to go Breslov. Because she was a very spiritual person and she wanted that level. So I mean, there are women who are also asking for that. And that was not anything to do with religious doubt or being enlightened. It was a certain kind of style of worship and a certain kind of spirituality.
I think Isaac Bleeman would be the last to ask a question.
Yeah, Ayala, that comment you just made reminded me of if you do a Google image search for Hasidic Jews, it's like all men.
It's all men. Yeah.
And black hats. Yeah, never women. My question is, I understand that doubt is a feature of the discourse that kind of defines membership in some of these subversive communities, but what about more mundane topics that are still seen to be non-Hasidic? You know, like, do people talk about sports and secular music and politics in a way that would maybe distinguish them from other more mainstream Hasidic voices?
Yeah, you mean like hidden heretics is what you mean?
Yeah, this group.
Yeah, absolutely, yes. I mean, the fact that men and women are talking together about anything makes it distinctive, right? And the fact that they are hanging out and spending time together. That I went to one party where they were singing together. They were singing Shabbos Miros, right? But they were singing together, which itself was unusual. In terms of topics, yes, I think, although I have to say, sort of in terms of politics, but I was consistently surprised at how much the conversations revolved around Hasidic Judaism. You know, like there was endless conversation about Hasidic politics, you know, which Rebbe, among men and among women. There were endless conversations about schools and kids and camp. There was less about, even when people explored, like I wrote a little bit about this, even when people explored together New York, like went out on the town, many saw Fiddler on the Roof. They weren't going to see, I don't know, Hamilton, for example, you know? And so one of the findings I sort of left this research with was that, yes, they were trying to create a new life in some ways, but it was always with the terms and the concepts and the categories of what they were used to. And so even eating out, you know, like one woman definitely tried all different cuisine, but most people, after initially trying non-kosher food, seem to go back to eating Hasidic foods. You know what I mean? And so I think there was, again, there's not that in and out. And so even when there were questioning and getting together, sometimes secular books. That I would say that's the one place, and it makes sense. Like there's a kind of literary tradition, but they shared books with each other. And before every holiday, you know, people took pictures for Facebook groups about what they were going to read for the holiday and asked for recommendations. And so there was a lot of support about secular reading and sort of catching up with like the literary canon that they had missed by being in yeshivas.
That's interesting. So it would be just as kind of out of the ordinary for a hidden heretic to be interested in NASCAR as it would be for a regular somebody who's, you know, fully in the community and identifies in that way.
Wait, what was the example you gave? A what?
NASCAR.
Oh, NASCAR. Yeah, I didn't see that so much, although there are a lot of Haredim now who are getting trucks and guns, from what I hear.
Okay.
A lot of Trump supporters. There's been like rallies on the streets of Brooklyn with big black trucks and guns. That's been very reassuring, but yes. Yeah, it was less of an exploration of the secular world than I had expected.
Thank you very much. I think unfortunately it's time to finish. That was a great lecture. We'll have it on YouTube so you can see it once again. There will be, we wanted to ask you if that would be possible to send us your slides to read Yiddish text, which was just small.
Yes, absolutely. Yes, yes. And thank you so much for having me. It was really fun.
Thank
you so much, Ayala. It was really fantastic. I just wanted to make the traditional end of talk announcement that we're going to have a bit of a summer break. So there's no seminar in July. The next one is going to be on the 3rd of August, and that will be Heather Monroe from University of Durham. And I'm just putting the link in there to the event right now because you can book it anytime. So thanks again, Ayala.
Thank you.